is the explicit prior permission for consent to kink, Creative Commons. This is something that you can pull from as part of your consent workshop. And we will give you the link so that you can get the slides if that's helpful to you. And the slides will include the notes. So don't worry about having to catch everything on the first go through. And the reason that we're doing this is it's really important for all of you to help educate everybody else about this legal framework for consent to kink that the American Law Institute created and approved in June 2021, and that's going to be published next year. Explicit prior permission decriminalizes BDSM in the revised Model Penal Code on sexual assault, and it's already providing a way for prosecutors to evaluate if there was consent for kink, and it's been introduced in a couple of criminal court cases by criminal defense attorneys who are trying to defend their clients who are accused of violating consent. So this training will provide information on the new consent definitions for kink, as well as how NCSF, Consent Counts Project, achieve this effort. And we'll also discuss how the stigma of criminalization has impacted our community. So we'll talk first about the ALI, NCSF, why explicit prior permission was created, why explicit prior permission is important to the kink community, exactly what is explicit prior permission, what people can do to help, as well as what they can do to learn more. So the first thing is, who is the ALI? The American Law Institute is an independent body. It's made up of influential lawyers, attorneys, law professors, judges from around the United States. The ALI analyzes legal issues and proposes this model legislation known as codes or reinstatements, and they recommend that states adopt this model legislation as their own law. So this requires that each state legislature must pass a bill that changes the state law. But many states have in the past adopted the ALI model codes without significant changes. So that's not a huge hurdle for us moving forward. But unfortunately, the last time that the ALI revised the Model Penal Code on sexual assault was in 1962. So that shows how badly a revision is needed and why state assault laws are such a confusing patchwork across the United States. Now, if you need to describe what the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom is, we are the other major player in the development of explicit prior permission. So NCSF is a coalition of alt-sex groups and businesses and private practices, over 120 coalition partners, primarily in the US. We are an advocacy group that changes systemic discrimination in government and private sector services. And we provide education about the alt-sex communities for these agencies and professionals, as well as the kink communities and the CNM communities. And NCSF was established in 1997, so we've been doing this for 26 years. Now, NCSF's involvement in creating explicit prior permission started in 2006, when decriminalizing BDSM was deemed the most critical issue that our communities face. And Consent Counts, the project, was created by the Leather Caucus at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Creating Change Conference. And soon after that, NCSF took responsibility for the Consent Counts project, and we began a series of initiatives. We did 3 different consent surveys, which generated a large number of peer-reviewed papers. We hosted consent discussions within our communities around the country that were like consciousness-raising exercises on consent. We created a consent statement in conjunction with kink educators, and it took 2 years to do that. And we also provided the consent education for the kink and CNM communities based on this information that we gathered. So in working with the community so deeply like this to document the issues, the Consent Count project is really similar to what NCSF did to help depathologize BDSM by working with the American Psychiatric Association to change their diagnostic manual in 2013, the DSM-5. So prior to that, kinky people were considered to have a mental illness, and often their child custody was removed by family court judges just because a parent was kinky. Whereas last year we had 7 kinky parents come to us for help. So similarly, the creation of explicit prior permission was groundbreaking because people who engage in BDSM and kink, even though it's consensual, may still be violating the current state law.
So, explicit prior permission was developed to counter that old saying that you may have heard that consent is not a defense to assault. And we say that because there's not a single appellate court decision anywhere in the country that has accepted consent as a defense in an assault or abuse prosecution arising from BDSM conduct. And an appellate case is a criminal case that has been appealed, and that sets case law, which is different from legislation that is passed by state legislatures. And these court cases include relatively mild activities like playing with a riding crop or dripping hot wax without burning someone. This is NCSF's legal database of consent cases involving BDSM and law review articles about legal cases involving BDSM and consent. Don't worry, you're not meant to read these, it's teeny tiny. This kind of criminalization feeds the stigma and discrimination against kinky people in our gathering places. Consent counts originally wanted to assist in an appellate case in support of consensual BDSM in order to overturn this outdated case law. However, there were no more prosecutions of consensual BDSM, ironically, in part due to the fact that NCSF educated law enforcement agencies around the country about BDSM, and the sort of alleged domestic violence call mostly became a thing of the past. Instead, there were only terrible cases where consent was denied by the bottom with serious injuries, like the Ed Bagley case in Missouri or the Glenn Marcus case in New York. So in 2015, we launched a sub-project we called at the time the American Law Institute Project, when the ALI began to revise the Model Penal Code on sexual assault. NCSF's legal counsel, Dick Cunningham, joined the ALI to liaison with them about consent for kink. As you can see from these footnotes that we're showing you, NCSF was cited in the reporter's notes of the revised Model Penal Code on sexual assault, section 213.10, which is affirmative defense of explicit prior permission for the use of force or restraint without sexual contact. So the ALI relied heavily on us for our information about our community's consent standards, which contributed to the creation of this legal framework for consent for BDSM activities that is called explicit prior permission. The Model Penal Code on sexual assault was approved by the entire ALI membership in 2021 and will be published in 2024. The text for the EPP is posted on our consent counts page, along with the commentary and the reporter's notes. So let's talk about why explicit prior permission is important. Consent Counts is working with allied organizations to get EPP passed in each state. However, the ALI states that EPP can be introduced into criminal court case or cited in briefs to replace that old outdated case law. And as Susan mentioned earlier, we've already done that a few times. Consent Counts, the committee, is creating public policy papers that show how explicit prior permission can be adopted to current state law, and you can find out how to support this effort on the Consent Counts page. In NCSF's 2020 consent survey, kinky respondents reported being closeted to family and coworkers. Decriminalizing BDSM will have a huge impact on the daily lives of kinky people because stigma leads to discrimination. We're also seeing more data that indicates that this stigma of being sick or violent leads to shame and guilt, which may be associated with suicide ideation. 80 to 90% of kinky respondents are closeted to family and coworkers. 20% are closeted to their partners. It's even worse for millions of people who haven't accessed educational groups and don't identify as kinky. This is just how they have sex. So they don't have access to consent and skills education, nor do they have access to groups and community members who could help destigmatize the things they want and teach them how to talk about sex. Debbie Herbenick's prevalent survey, Sexual Diversity in America, found that up to 30% of adults engage in BDSM activities, but less than 4% reported attending an educational workshop. The stigma and criminalization of BDSM also leads to barriers to reporting crimes committed in a BDSM context. In our 2015 survey, out of over 1,000 people who reported non-consensual experiences, less than 3% said that they reported it to the police. While our communities are largely self-regulating, sometimes something criminal happens and we need to use the justice system. And our justice system is not good with sexual assault survivors, especially those with intersectional identities. But it's the system we're trying to fix, so we have to work with those who can affect the system, and step by step, we make progress. If the legal system can better accommodate BDSM-related cases through explicit prior permission, one of the major barriers to reporting will be reduced.
So what is explicit prior permission? You keep on hearing us talk about that, and you heard me go through the 5 brief things. I want to go into a little bit more in depth so that you can explain this to people when they ask. Section 213.10, affirmative defense of explicit prior permission states, you may personally give another person explicit prior permission to use or threaten to use physical force or restraint, or to inflict or threaten to inflict any harm in conjunction with an act of sexual penetration, oral sex, or sexual contact. So one of the first things we want to make clear is that caveat, whatever is done, it can't cause serious injury. So even with consent, you're not allowed to seriously injure somebody, which has been well defined in law as impairment of a limb or organ, so it's like a dysfunction, a permanent mark, or causing a substantial risk of death. So that means that this legal framework can't be used as a defense for certain kinds of edge play, like breath play, employing compression of the neck, or bondage suspension where nerve damage is done, or where branding, where a permanent mark is left. So keep that in mind. It's a huge step forward from criminalizing hot wax and riding crops. But there is a legal line under explicit prior permission that if your kink acts cross that line, it could be called into question in court. Now, technically, Section 213 only applies to BDSM interactions that include touching the buttocks, breasts, clothed or unclothed, or the genitals, or it includes, oral, anal sex. But in NCSF's last consent survey, the 2021 though, we asked, and 90% of the 3,000 respondents reported that they like to do some kind of sexual touch or penetration with their kink activities. Also, things like spanking do constitute sexual touch because it's touching the buttocks, even if they're closed. But NCSF's consent counts committee has gone far beyond this, and our public policy papers are adapting explicit prior permission for both sexual assault and assault law, which would then cover BDSM acts that don't include that sexual contact. So the way that you get permission, it has to be explicit. So that means it has to either be verbal or by written agreement. Now that right there means that explicit prior permission doesn't include body language, and it doesn't include past behavior to determine current consent. It means you have to talk about what you want to do with somebody in order to come to an agreement before you use erotic force or restraint. And even then, there's 3 caveats that have to be met. So we'll go through all 3. Number A says specifying when someone can ignore your expressions of unwillingness or absence of consent. This was very important to us because we wanted to make sure that we got role play protected. We wanted to still be able to do kidnap play where you protest or you fight, or master-slave play, or even consensual non-consent. So this number A is really a nod to our entire way of doing power exchange. Number B is identifying the specific forms and extent of force, restraint, or threats that are permitted. So that's opt-in negotiation. When I started 30 years ago, we did opt-out negotiation. Now it's all opt-in negotiation. So you want to find out what it is that you want to do And that means everybody has to understand the risks involved. This is informed consent, because how can you decide the extent and level of force if you don't know the risks that are involved? So this encompasses our things like, do you want marks or no marks? Do you want this study toy, that thingy toy? Hands, no paddles, no canes, right? And it also includes sexual touching, which is something that the kink community has gotten very good about negotiating the kink activities. We have to remind people, negotiate the sexual touching that goes along with the erotic force or restraint. And number C is amazing. We're thrilled about this because it's stipulating the specific words or gestures that will withdraw the permission. This is our safe word, right? Or a safe signal. And this includes if you're doing consensual non-consent. There seems to be a general movement to think that consensual non-consent means you can't withdraw consent. No, you can always withdraw consent. As we say, it's not a roller coaster. You can get off at any time. And of course, this doesn't have to be a safe word. There's some people that just communicate naturally and say, when I say stop, I mean stop. If I say no, I mean no, right? But you have to have a way to withdraw that permission. Now, explicit prior permission, if you're asked, the legal framework for consent to kink is grounded in Lawrence v. Texas, which overturned the sodomy laws in the state. And Lawrence v. Texas is an amazing decision for us because it holds that adults have a constitutionally protected privacy and autonomy rights to engage in mutually consensual sexual activities. So grounding explicit prior permission on this means that as long as the person giving permission does it personally, is a competent adult of sound mind, as long as the force used poses no risk of serious injury, then this respect for individual autonomy requires a deference to these choices. Now, I do want to point out that along with the definition of consent to BDSM in the revised model penal code, there's also a definition for consent for just general sexual contact without any use of force or restraint. This was approved back in 2016. And this definition of consent is really critical because it's already being considered by states. There's 20 states that don't have a definition of consent in their sexual assault law, which means how can you judge if somebody was assaulted or not, right? So this is something that states are looking towards. It does reflect what the states that do have a definition of what is the legal standard for consent. So we'll be seeing more and more about this. So this definition, though, see, consent means a person's willingness to engage in a specific act of sexual contact. It's not real affirmative consent, unlike explicit prior permission, which is a true affirmative consent because you talk about it first and figure out what you're going to do. And that's because of the two things. The second point here where it says consent may be expressed or it may be inferred from behavior, both action and inaction in the context of all circumstances. And number three, neither verbal nor physical resistance is required to establish that consent is lacking, but their absence may be considered in the context of all the circumstances. So this is talking about things like body language being acceptable to get consent. And context is things like whether you've had sex with somebody before, or if this is your first time together. It can also be, what is the situation that you're in? This is why NCSF's not actually lobbying for this general definition of consent. We are only focused on explicit prior permission. And of course, we're looking to states like Illinois, which does have a more affirmative consent definition in their sexual assault law. So we believe that they will be more open and willing to adopting explicit prior permission for the use of erotic force or restraint. And also, we will find affirmative consent is in colleges. Most colleges fall under Title IX, which has an affirmative consent model. We have to receive permission for sexual touch. So just to recap, explicit prior permission for consent to kink, you need explicit permission before you begin to do specific BDSM activities. So no renegotiating in the middle of your scenes. The consent needs to be risk aware and informed, not just I'm game for anything. You also need a safe word or a way to stop what's happening at any time. And this conforms to many of the current consent standards found in the kink community. If you just pop this slide into your normal presentation, you can kind of cover just in brief what explicit prior permission is. People may ask, does this cover like MS relationships where there's a contract? Which is great because explicit prior permission given for a range of activities that's put down where everybody can see it. But we do suggest that if you have a long-standing contract, it might be good to reaffirm that consent immediately prior to using erotic force or restraint. And that's something that you could do through a specific ritual to ask somebody to keep in that MS mindset. It's also something that even, Leathermen who do have a more implied before denied consent model in their community, and particularly their play spaces where sexual touching may happen, NCSF encourages them to post consent signs and information in their registration packet. So everybody knows when they go into this setting, this is the kind of touch that may be happening. So they can consent kind of prior to going in or avoid it if that's something that they really don't want to. And now Tess is going to talk about how you can educate people about how to get their state to adopt explicit prior permission for consent to kink.
We need you to help spread the word. We want you to talk to your friends, post our consent infographics on social media, speak out at groups and events, join NCSF as a member and ask your group to join. Tell people to contact us if they're having a criminal issue so we can consult with their attorney or the prosecutor and investigator. If your group doesn't have consent policy or procedures to deal with consent violations. If your group would like to provide education to your members about consent, BDSM, and the law, email us and let us know and we'll help you. You can prepare for lobbying by researching your own state legislatures and find out how much do they advocate for marginalized groups like the LGBTQIA plus communities, homeless shelters, harm reduction, domestic violence organizations, or social justice movements. Do any of them have a law enforcement background? Have any of them supported sexual assault prevention legislation? This will lay the ground to lobbying state legislatures to adopt explicit prior permission as your state law. Locally, you can do outreach to your local rape crisis center or anti-violence project and suggest that NCSF give them an interpersonal violence and BDSM cultural competency webinar. Volunteer for your local crisis center. They need your help and your voice for kink and consensually non-monogamous survivors. Consent Counts and the NCSF is now educating kink communities about EPP. The next step is to educate our allies, like victims advocacy organizations, state coalitions against sexual assault, and LGBTQIA and sex worker advocacy organizations. We'll also educate the legal community, defense attorneys, prosecutors, investigators, that explicit prior permission is the basis for consensual kink, and equip prosecution for when someone doesn't get explicit prior permission or when serious injury is done. Based on this new legal framework for explicit prior permission, we have updated and created new resources for groups that you can share with others. So we have new best practices for consent to kink. We have new best practices for consensual non-monogamy. We have a guide for groups, which is consent policies and procedures that outlines options and sets expectations for members experiencing consent issues inside and outside of your events, with procedures for how consent reports will be dealt with so everyone is on the same page. This consent PMP can be adjusted for your group's consent culture and structure. And then we have our guide to groups and also an outing guide. This document can be adjusted to your group to deal with the outing of members and set expectations around what is allowed with sharing information outside of your group. And to find out more about EPP, visit our webpage and go to the Consent Counts Project.